back in 1997, the CRTC gave a license to Playboy Channel so that you could watch pornography, but they said no to Christian religious stations that wanted to have radio and TV stations.
You know, like does a rural like Montana hunting show, is that an American content that diverts away from Canadiana, so to speak, in a way that's significantly more egregious than a drag queen story hour show based in Ottawa? Like, what is that Canadian by virtue of just being based in Canada?
But we don't need a new CRTC. We don't need somebody to tell us what's Canadian or not Canadian and to manipulate algorithms.
Hi guys, welcome back to the Critical Compass. My name is Mike and we're with James, and we are very pleased to be joined again by returning guest. He just happens to like us, I guess, because he keeps showing up. Mr. John Carpay of the JCCF. Mr. Carpay, thank you again for joining us. We're here primarily to discuss today a new report that was just released on the JCCF site. Mission Creep, Is It Time to Abolish the CRTC? And the subtitle here, How a Federal Regulator Controls What Canadians Share, Discover, and Consume Online. This is a great document. It looks like primary author Nigel Hannaford did a great job here. We read through it the other day, and we have questions for you, and I'm sure you have lots of things you want to discuss about it. So please, sir, the floor is yours.
Well, glad to be with you guys again, with your viewers and listeners. It's a bit of a radical. I'm not aware of other groups or organizations that have called for the abolition of the CRTC, but we think it's long overdue. It started out in 1968 as a regulator of radio and television, and they tried to, the purpose was to minimize how much Canadians got exposed to American television and American radio. So they said, well, if you want to have a radio or TV station, you need to have a license. But if you want to have a license, you have to agree to our conditions. And conditions were things that, in prime time, say between 6 p.m. and 11 p.m., whatever prime time was, you had to have, 70% Canadian content. And there have been arguments over the years, what is Canadian content anyway? Because maybe somebody in downtown Toronto would have a very different perspective over what it means to be Canadian compared to somebody in rural Saskatchewan, or somebody in Nova Scotia might have a different idea of Canadian than somebody in Montreal. Anyway, they had these Canadian content rules where they're in charge of that, and the purpose was to keep to minimize exposure to American radio and television. Now, with the internet, that's changed things a lot. In 2023, 2.5 years ago, we got the Online Streaming Act, which actually gave the CRTC, so Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, right? So it's a government body, quasi-independent from the federal government. So it's not directly controlled by, say, the Prime Minister and the cabinet ministers, but they do appoint the people to it. So they're going to appoint people that agree with them and, do what they want, but there's no direct control. So the CRTC, with Bill C-11 in 2023, got legal authority over the internet. And what they've been doing the last 2.5 years is manipulating algorithms to push to the forefront that which they deem to be Canadian. And it's not outright censorship, but it's certainly kind of, I'm giving the microphone to you, but not to you. And it gives increased exposure to what they deem to be Canadian. Which, by the way, one of the debates back in 1997, the CRTC gave a license to Playboy Channel so that you could watch pornography, which I guess was somehow very Canadian, and a golf channel, but they said no to Christian religious stations that wanted to simply have radio and TV stations, right? Which nobody would be forced, if they had received the licenses, nobody's forced to listen to that. If you're not interested, you turn it off or you don't tune into it in the first place. Anyway, there's an example, right? Oh, this is what happens when you give a government body the power to decide what is Canadian. They say yes to Playboy and they say no to Christian broadcasting.
So is that partially, like, it's ridiculous, and it's in practice you're seeing where this falls, or like where it falls apart under its own logic. Is that partially because of how it classifies different types of media, which then there's arbitrary rules because now faith-based channels are under a different subset than like the adult entertainment. And I know some of this can get into a tricky place because some of these underlying principles are that we want all groups to be represented. We want to be nice to everybody. We want to make sure that we don't have Christians more represented than other faiths. So I can see how they would, with that underlying ideology that informs many of the people in these positions. Do you think there's an ideological component, like informing this decision making?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the CRTC, like most government bodies, like most universities, pursues equity, diversity, inclusion, which means the LGBTQ rainbow agenda to, continue to whatever. That's a whole ideology that is kind of the opposite of, say, Orthodox Judaism or conservative Christianity or Islam. It's kind of a sexual libertine agenda. That's part of the ideology. They promote the idea that our legal rights should depend in part on our race or ancestry. So you got special legal rights for Aboriginals that the other 95% of Canadians are not entitled to. You've got equity, diversity, inclusion. You've got the so-called anti-racism. You've got this is their whole ideological bent that we are seeing all around us, which is why the less power that government bodies have to enforce that ideology, the better. It should swim or sink. It should rise or fall on its own merits, right? And not have that government support. And we're in an internet age where you've got millions, if not billions, of different websites. Everybody can start up their own YouTube channel or podcast without the CRTC, which is why their long-term goal, of course, they'd like to see, and they have this on the books, actually. If the CRTC wanted to regulate this, the critical compass, they could do it. They just haven't exercised their power yet. But they have that power under Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act. They could get you to fill out paperwork and report annually on how much Canadian content you have, and they could do all kinds of things. They couldn't outright censor you, but they could get you to jump through a whole bunch of different hoops. And if you did not jump through those hoops, then they would say, okay, well, we're taking your license away, which is why I would encourage you to never register, just remain unregistered. I mean, the moment you register yourself with the CRTC, you're asking to be dominated and subjugated and put in your place.
Yeah, interesting. That's right before we got on here, James and I were talking. And James, I'm just gonna straight up steal your example because it was so good.
Do it.
We were musing on the thought, like, what exactly does it mean to be Canadian content? Like, does a rural like Montana hunting show, for example, from the U.S. that you've got hunters on the same land essentially that's in Alberta and Saskatchewan hunting the same animals that are in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Is that an American content that diverts away from Canadiana, so to speak, in a way that's significantly more egregious than say a drag queen story hour show based in Ottawa? Like, what is that Canadian by virtue of just being based in Canada? Like, what do these terms really mean, Mr. Carpay? Please define them.
Well, you got this like downtown Toronto, NDP, liberal, LGBTQ, equity, diversity, inclusion mindset. It's gotten worse in recent years. That's always been their definition of Canadian. You're not going to get much in the way of firearms owners that are hunting deer, or conservative Christians that are worshiping at church. I mean, it's really it's got kind of the left-wing downtown Toronto slant to it, and
there's almost
that's Canadian.
We've talked a little bit about this over the last year, just partially because we've been having so many conversations about what Canada used to be and what Canada is now, and I feel like that's the difference, is that there are many people who they're somewhat nostalgic for the culture and the things that Canada and the way that Canada used to function. And in a way now, this Canadian spirit is a surface level. I've used the term like a maple syrup branded Canadian identity, where it's superficial. Essentially, what you have with some of these, with the programming that they're prioritizing, is you have something that looks like it could take place in Los Angeles just from the stories being told or just the ideological framework, except it's just filmed in Ottawa or Toronto, and it just has a Canadian backdrop with the most surface level, identifying things that makes, maybe there's a bit of snow, maybe there's that little bit of an accent, but other than that, the framework behind it is no different than like New York or Los Angeles from what it's drawing upon from a cultural standpoint.
Well, I would ask the question, like, why do we need a government body to, help us out, so to speak, when we can listen to watch the TV show, just decide for ourselves what TV shows we want to watch, what radio stations we want to listen to, without somebody that, we're paying millions of dollars to the, nearly 700 employees that they have. And but why are we doing this in the first place? Why do we need that supervision, that regulation in the first place?
Does it imply that Canadians are too stupid to be able to choose what they want to watch, or we're too fragile that if not for this benevolent organization, like we would be automatically harmed by consuming too much American content or
American?
Yeah.
Well, that seems to be the underlying premise, right? This is why, again, we've had this around now for 57 years, the CRTC. Before the CRTC was created, even going back to the 1930s, we had a Radio Broadcasting Act, which was federal legislation. And then in the 30s, we got a Replacement Broadcasting Act, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, was created. Was probably, I would make an assumption, it was probably more mainstream at that time and hadn't been taken over by, Marxist woke ideologues. I'm making an assumption. I haven't looked at what the CBC was producing in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on. But definitely there's this idea that, Canadians are fragile. We need to be protected from American content. Otherwise, we're somehow going to lose our identity. And I think there's a kernel of truth in that. If you would, you might remember the late Ted Byfield, who died within the past 4 or 5 years and ran Alberta Report magazine. And he was 70 years old in 1993. Forget his exact age, but he was born, I think, in 1920 ish. And he said in his youth, and until Pierre Elliott Trudeau took over, took power in 1968, until Pierre Elliott Trudeau became Prime Minister, Canada's identity was British. We were British North America, according to Ted Byfield. And we had the Royal Mail and the royal this and the royal that and the royal everything. And at movie theaters, people sang God Save the Queen long before O Canada became popular. As back in the day, you just apparently when people gathered in a movie theater, it was kind of like a public meeting. So people would sing the national anthem, which was God Save the Queen. And so everybody was very, very, very British. The country had a British feel to it. We drove on the left side of the road at one point in history, although I think it was quite a long time ago that we switched to the right. But so we were this British North America is what Canada was. And Pierre Elliott Trudeau didn't like that. And so he successfully repudiated that British heritage and came up with ideas of biculturalism, French English, and then multiculturalism. And then his son, Justin Trudeau, told us, Canada's a post-national state. Like, we don't really, I think he might be correct, or at least partially correct, right? Like when you repudiate the old British heritage and you don't really have anything too definitive to replace it with, you're down into this post-national state. And then all you have left is sort of this knee-jerk anti-Americanism. Well, what is a Canadian? Well, we're not American.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but what is a Canadian? Well, we're not American. So that's where we're at today. We're not American.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the heart of the matter, isn't it? I mean, how are you supposed to have anything resembling an objective definition of what Canadiana or Canadian content means if your prime minister deems the country to be a post-national state? Like you say, I mean, it's not, you're not, this has been a concern that a lot of our guests have talked about, and we've talked about as well, in that Canadians, at least in the modern conception and, say in the, last 10, 15 years, it's become very overt, this negative definition of what a Canadian means. Like you say, it's not American. That's what a Canadian is. We live sort of in the same area, and we speak the same language, and we're sort of the same, demographics for the most part, but we're not them. We're just not. Well, yeah, if you're not making a positive claim on what you actually are, how are you meant to defend that as some sort of cultural institution?
And essentially, we're just in this shared economic zone, which, again, all this sets...
Not so much shared as much these days, but yeah I agree with you.
That's what Canada is turning into, is a shared economic zone for people to immigrate to. So part of this, like the withering down of the identity, has opened the doors to a type of immigration that doesn't have the cultural glue. Where you look at where immigration started from, there is a high bar of assimilation, and the amount of assimilation that somebody would have to go through is much higher, and you'd see people integrate in a way that is not happening in the last 10 years to the same degree. And I think that goes hand in hand with the more surface level a national identity becomes, the less assimilation you're expecting. You've essentially lowered the bar, that all it takes is to just walk on this magic soil for a certain amount of time, and then you get a piece of paper, and then you are that thing.
I can't disagree with you. It's a change in identity as well. Ted Byfield would have said, and I think this is historically accurate, that Canada was not known as this peace-loving, anti-war nation. Like there's this notion of, well, Americans are a bunch of warmongers. They're always going to war. But we Canadians, we're more sophisticated. We're more enlightened. We just really love peace. First of all, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but if it was true, it's a very recent thing, because in World War I, the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but Canadians volunteered en masse to go fight for king and country. And they wanted to fight against the the Germans in World War I. Now, in 1917, 3/4 of the way through the war, conscription was made mandatory, and they started forcing people. Although even that fact too, right? First you have waves of volunteers, and then the government says, okay, now we're going to force other people who didn't volunteer. We're going to force them to go to Europe and to fight. So we were very warlike in World War I. And that's maybe part and parcel being part of the British Empire. And so when England was under attack by Germany, I mean, indirectly, they were at war. The Germans were not invading England, but they were at war. And everybody felt like we're going to go fight for king and country. And then in World War II, Canada was one of the first in, I think it was just a few hours or a day or two after Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany. And then Canada was very quick to also declare war on Nazi Germany. We also declared war on Imperial Japan, even though it wasn't, it was Pearl Harbor. It was the Americans who got bombed on December the 7th, 1941, not Canada. But we declared war on Japan. We declared war on Germany. And we fought hard. And so we were this very militaristic nation that was fighting battles. We fought in Korea. So this whole idea that we're, kind of this anti-war, peace lovers that won't fight, that's just fairly recent in Canadian history.
Yeah, and people forget too that the for decades, the PPCLI and the JTF2 have been considered like world-class forces. I think JTF2 is maybe only behind I can't think of the name right now of the the Israeli special forces, but they're considered like even deadlier than the Navy SEALs. I mean, it's a very, very, very highly advanced and lethal force. So yeah, no, Canadians. I remember reading a write up about how Canadians were actually volunteering in pretty high numbers to take the place of Americans who were draft dodging during the Vietnam War as well. Like that was even going up into the 60s and 70s. That's not that long ago.
Yeah. Well, and I apologize. I don't know the specific nature of the Canadian government's stance on Vietnam. We were not forcing people to go and fight there.
No.
There was not a draft or conscription.
No.
But yeah, now it's like anybody that comes here, you be who you want to be, you do what you want to do, and we're all Canadians, But let's not please ask the hard questions of what that actually means.
Yeah.
It's
and so a lot of this, when I was reading the document, it feels like with the history of when the CRTC started, a lot of this was maybe invisible, like it's kind of running in the background where, okay, we know about the 30% Canadian content, but the average person they don't really see the in and out of all the regulations that shape the way that content's made or who gets access or how it's distributed. They're not aware of all of that back end. So for the most part, it's this layer that's running invisibly, shaping the bubble that Canadians kind of exist in. And then this is where you get kind of the average CBC viewer has a very curated view of the world. You try to talk to them outside of issues that they've seen on CBC or some other mainstream news, and it's like it never existed in the first place. So these bubbles are partially crafted, and I think the Online Streaming Act was maybe one of the first times that it became a little bit more obvious, where people would go to something and it would pop up on their phone and they can't actually access it because now they're noticing that it's blocked in Canada, where before it was a little bit more invisible. But do you think the awareness from the average person is high enough that they see the CRTC as a problem? Or is there more awareness and more of a cultural shift that needs to happen to change some minds?
Well, I think it's the latter. I would venture a guess that the overwhelming majority of Canadians, 60, 70, 80%, might not even have heard of the CRTC or know what the CRTC does. And in the big picture, it's one federal body with 700 employees, so it's not as big of a fish as others. You mentioned the CBC. There's you probably heard of our report 2 months ago on the rising euthanasia, where it's the fourth leading cause of death in Canada, and it's gone from we're up to like 16,500 people died by assisted suicide in Canada. And but I think if that assisted suicide program continues to expand the way it is, where in Alberta now the government's introduced legislation to make it either illegal or more difficult for the healthcare people to push for assisted suicide. We've had so many reports where people are, they're going in for back surgery or something, and it's, oh, by the way, do you want MAID? It's just presented as, do you want to kill yourself? It's just presented repeatedly as an option. So provincial government stepping in saying you can't, you have to wait for the patient to bring it up, which I think is a very wise measure. Why did I go on to assisted suicide? It's because the number of, if the rates of assisted suicide keep on escalating the way that they are, there's not going to be too many CBC watchers left over in a few years, and the CBC viewership is going to decline even further than what it has now.
But even with
it's a little bit
viewership numbers going down, you're still going to get $1 billion going to CBC every year.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, it's the CBC is a propaganda machine for a big government, anti-freedom, woke ideology. And if there was a CBC person joining us right now, they'd be pounding the table saying, we are strictly nonpartisan, to which I would say, yeah, you're strictly nonpartisan as between the Liberals and the NDP, but it's the philosophy that the CBC promotes that I think has a big influence to get people to vote for the Greens and the Bloc and the Liberals and the NDP. The parties of the political left have got daily support from the CBC because its coverage is so slanted. They always interview people. When Charlie Kirk got assassinated, okay, the CBC did a smear job and said that he was a fascist and he was far right. And just simply by who they interviewed, they would go and they interview people who said, Charlie Kirk's probably a racist, he's far right, he's fascist. That's a smear job that they do because they only interview those people. They're not going to interview somebody who says that Charlie Kirk was a great hero. They're not going to interview somebody who understands the difference between conservatism and fascism. Sure, fascism has a lot more in common with socialism than what it does with conservatism, but they're not going to interview people that see it that way. But everything's kind of, far right, neo-Nazi. If you don't agree with the CBC, you are far right. And there's just no distinction for them between conservatives and fascists. It's all kind of, part of the same evil grouping. So that's their daily ideology. So it's unfortunate, but yeah, they might still get lots of money, but as their viewership declines, they have less and less influence, which is beautiful. I'm glad.
Yeah. Amen. Just to clarify a point I made earlier before I asked you a different question, in case I misspoke, what I meant to say was there were Canadians who volunteered to fight on behalf of American forces to compensate for the American draft dodgers. So I just looked it up to verify. Okay. And apparently there was between 20 and 30,000 American draft dodgers who moved to Canada to avoid the Vietnam War. And they estimate up to 40,000 Canadians volunteered to fight for the U.S. Armed Forces in replacement. So that's just an interesting tidbit of history. But
that's your elbows up history moment.
Yeah. But I couldn't help but notice, John, when I was reading the report, it seems to me like the thing that kept popping into my head when I was reading this is that it feels to me like a similar thing that the CRTC does to what we do in the dairy cartel in this country. And it feels like under the guise of protecting consumers and making sure that whatever flowery language you want to use. It really actually is just simply a control mechanism to prop up an industry that would otherwise fail because of, whatever variables you want to say. Is that an oversimplification of what the modern CRTC does, or is that kind of on point, you think?
Well, the difference is that the dairy cartel keeps the prices high for Canadian consumers, and every year they pour millions of liters of milk down the drain that could be going to poor people or food banks or whatever, and they keep the prices a lot higher than what they would be. So yeah, and they restrict competition. If I wanted to, uh, you know, start up a dairy operation and buy a few cows and milk them and sell the milk, I wouldn't be allowed to do that unless I, first had to, spend a lot of money to buy quota. So, so that the CRTC is different insofar as it's not going to prevent me from starting a podcast or a video cast or setting up a new website. So,
Not yet.
it's not really
Yeah,
blocking
don't give them any ideas.
the entry. Um, it is costing us more money though, because as the paper describes, right, it reduces competition. It's got all these rules in place that basically allow TELUS and Rogers and Bell to remain dominant, because it's very hard for smaller companies to break in. So in that sense, the CRTC is very similar to the dairy cartel in that they make it, the CRTC makes it very difficult for newcomers to come in there and compete effectively. It's like, well, that's very hard to do.
Mhm.
So, yeah, with that element of both them controlling content, and then you have the restriction side, and then you have the grant side, which another government program where they're subsidizing certain types of content and not subsidizing. When you add those two together, the suppression through selective distribution and then the amplification, that's a quite a significant tilt. And with those two in play, so you will always have people that are ideological. But if a system is structured in a certain way, that some systems enable corruption more than others, and it will enable people with ideology to take hold of that system. So if we abolish the CRTC and put in something else, what essential roles would this new regulator, what should they do? And what is a structure that would help prevent any future corruption?
I would replace it with nothing. I think the only restrictions on the internet should be when people are violating the criminal law. So if somebody is producing, creating, selling, distributing child pornography, the law enforcement, the authorities need to get in there and find out who is doing it and where they live, and they should throw the book at those people and get the search warrants, get whatever they need to do surveillance on people. If you have reasonable and probable grounds that somebody's breaking the law, the police can go to court. They can get a court order to do surveillance. So I don't believe in an absolute total free-for-all on the internet, insofar as I think we should stop the child pornography. And if it was up to me, I'd place restrictions on other pornography as well, because I think it causes an awful lot of damage. Although, it does. It's a bit of a tricky issue. I believe in individual choice as well, so it's kind of, I have conflicted feelings about that whole issue. But we don't need a new CRTC. We don't need somebody to tell us what's Canadian or not Canadian, and to manipulate algorithms so that Canadians will more likely see more of some things and less of other things. We just don't need that at all. in my view. So I don't think we need to ensure that there's competition. Okay, so we've got the Competition Act federally, and this makes it illegal for large companies to collude with each other and keep the small guy out. So we've got competition law that should be enforced. So that's the role of government. Is you have Competition Act, you punish collusion, you make sure that there's no unfair barriers to new people trying to enter a market, and crack down on crime, and that's it. I don't think we need a federal body to be regulating these things.
Yeah, that pretty much aligns with where James and I stand a lot on just the general more of a libertarian stance on those sort of things, I suppose, if you wanted to label it. I wanted to ask you, there's a section in the report where it talks about the kind of the gradual expansion of what the CRTC controlled, starting off obviously just with radio and television, expanding in the 80s, in the mid 70s, with to include telecommunications companies, in the 80s, with regard to cable TV services and channel offerings, things like this. But when the internet, became a thing and became quite popular and obviously exploded in popularity, they initially took a much more maybe a cautious approach, I guess you could say. There's a section here where it talks about how Stephen Harper favored minimal internet intervention, believing that governments should adapt to the open, free internet rather than regulate it. I remember personally in the 2015 federal election. Now, try not to hit quit on this interview, but I voted for the NDP during that election, and I specifically remember why I voted for them, because Tom Mulcair, as the leader of the NDP, was the only one of the major party leaders to come out very much in favor of net neutrality. And he seemed at the time very committed to the principle of net neutrality. He thought that the negotiations surrounding the Trans-Pacific Partnership at the time were going to allow a backdoor for ISPs to regulate internet traffic unjustly and all sorts of things. So I liked that at the time. I was thinking about these sorts of things. Now, it seems to me that somebody on the left side of the political spectrum, a liberal or specifically an NDP voter, they seem to me to be the people who are most in favor of heavily regulating the internet. What do you make of this sort of cultural shift that we see now, where it seems like it's conservatives who are approaching this? It's not new anymore, but it's ever expanding. Conservatives seem to be approaching this technology from a much more progressive and libertarian perspective.
Now, supporters of big government are typically extremely short-sighted, and it doesn't occur to them that same government machinery could be flipped around and used against them. So right now, you'd find people on the political left would love the idea of giving the Canadian Human Rights Commission the power to prosecute discriminatory speech. Yeah. So this is not criminal hate speech, but it's speech that's discriminatory. We had this provision in the Online Harms Act, which fortunately died with the 2025 election. The federal government keeps on saying they're going to bring the Online Harms Act back. And one of the provisions in there is to empower the Canadian Human Rights Commission to prosecute discriminatory speech with penalties of up to $50,000 paid to government, up to $20,000 paid to a complainant. And not to mention the tens of thousands of dollars in legal bills you're going to be out of pocket to defend yourself against prosecution. And, people on the left think this is great because then we can, punish supposedly bad people like Barry Neufeld in British Columbia, who publicly speaks out against the transgender ideology and says we shouldn't be harming children by teaching them that it's possible to become a member of the opposite sex. And so the BC Human Rights Tribunal has ordered Barry Neufeld to pay $750,000 to a small group of LGBT teachers in Chilliwack. So it's just, it's just crazy that way. But people favor this, but it doesn't occur to them that if the government, if the cultural tides change and you get maybe you get a Muslim-dominated government that is going to punish Islamophobia and blaspheming the Prophet Muhammad, and they're going to crack down on LGBTQ speech, and they're going to say that it's a perversion and it's unnatural and it's sick and it's this and it's that. Then what do you do then? Then you've got big government that can direct its guns against you. But this is not what people think about. It's just like, yeah, go. Let's have the hate speech restrictions. Let's bring back the Online Harm Act. Let's have the government deciding what's true and false by way of, promising to protect us from hate and disinformation, misinformation. It's just short-sightedness is a big part of it. These people can't imagine that the machinery of the state would ever be used against them.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't occur to them.
Yeah.
Can I admit a crime on this podcast right now? This morning,
Sure.
I conducted a hate crime. I had some bacon, and well, I joke, but that could be considered under the right. If the right people get in power, that could be part of some that could be a symbol of hate. I could even imagine if people troll on the internet enough and use the bacon emoji in a hateful way, I could see that kind of a meme being treated as a hate offense.
A hate symbol.
Simply of a hate symbol of you're trying to make fun of somebody's religion, and since they can't eat bacon, that is now a hateful symbol. And you can see how ridiculous these things get when taken to the logical extent of just measuring it based on hurt feelings, because an emoji could hurt feelings, and maybe they want to ban an emoji because it's used by enough people. That's how any word turns into something hateful or a slur. It's common enough use that it becomes ingrained culturally, and then at some point they say well, now that's a bad word and you can't say it. But
the biggest threat, or one of the biggest threats to free speech, is just this notion that people are entitled to not feel hurt or offended. Now, I'd be the first to say that as a matter of civility, as a matter of politeness, as a matter of courtesy, we should try to get our points across as much as possible without being really awful, nasty, vicious towards people who disagree with us. So, we should focus on arguments and so on. Having said that, invariably, all speech is going to offend at least somebody, okay? If an atheist says that religion is stupid and all religious followers are naive, gullible, credulous, misguided, anti-science, whatever. Look, I've got a thick skin. Most of us have a thick skin. We're not going to lose sleep over it. But there will be people who are deeply hurt. So what? This atheist is calling religious people stupid. Well, people criticize Islam. People criticize Judaism. People criticize Israel. You're always going to have people that feel hurt or offended by something, whether it's a huge number or a small number. You're going to have people hurt. So what's disturbing is that a lot of Canadians will say, well, I support free speech as long as it's not offensive. It's everything, certainly in the realm of religion and politics, but I would say even in every realm, you could be running an interior design company and criticize a certain style of interior decorating or something. Somebody's going to be offended. So you can't have this, I support free speech, but as long as it's not offensive. No, free speech necessarily includes a right to offend. Not that offending people is your goal. It's sort of a byproduct, but it has to include that right to offend, because the moment you say that, I have a right to not feel offended, you have a right to not feel offended, you no longer have free speech.
That's so true. It's that they say, Jordan Peterson has said this, many, various free speech warriors say, you don't need provisions for freedom of speech for uncontroversial speech. It's specifically only the controversial speech that is the purpose for why free speech laws exist. And I think that maybe points to a grander problem right now in our specifically Western culture in general, where they call this. I just looked it up, and I apologies if I'm wrong. I think this is right. There's an American writer named Rob Henderson who coined a term called luxury beliefs. And this sort of describes this this conflation of uh, you know words or violence, and insult is, to be insulted is the same thing as to be physically harmed, and these are things that only people with truly privileged existences can spend time thinking about and worrying about. And I think that, I don't know if you've done much thinking or talking about this notion of a decadent culture, sort of at the pinnacle of its influence, a culture in decline, where they, that starts to hyper focus inward on feelings as the walls crumble around them. So this is maybe a broader philosophical topic, but do you sense do you get that sort of feeling maybe in your personal, in your day-to-day life, of that's the sort of culture we're living in, which leads to us having to have conversations about this?
Any culture that has the word microaggressions as part of its vocabulary is a pretty decadent culture.
Yeah.
It is. We've become, frankly, we've become a bunch of sissies. I mean, you looked at the whole lockdown experience, where previous generations have understood that death is part of life, and it's normal for people to die, and it's especially normal for older people to die. And in prior years, yeah, and I'm not trivializing it or making light of it. I mean, when my grandmother died, when I was 21 years old, I was devastated. It was horrific. She and I were extremely close. So I don't make light of old people dying. I do say that it's a part of life that people generally die, and most of the deaths are people in their 70s and 80s and 90s, more so than people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. That's just a fact of life. And so COVID comes along, and all of a sudden we have this narrative that seems to be predicated on the idea that nobody ever dies, and COVID's the first time in human history that people are dying, and that this is somehow unacceptable. And so you have, elderly people who in prior years were dying of cancer and heart disease and stroke and emphysema and whatever, all these different causes, and, not featured on the 6 o'clock news and the 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock news, not sort of an hourly reporting on death. And then we get COVID, and all of a sudden it's as if nobody's ever died before, and old people have never died before. And now we're all shocked and terrified that there's people who are already old and have multiple health conditions they're in their last few months or their last year of life, and they're dying. And there's just this incredible fear of death that I don't think that they could have pulled a stunt like this in the 1950s. When in fact, we had more severe viruses. The Asian flu of 1957, the Hong Kong flu of 1968 were more deadly than COVID, and life went on. People said, well, it's unfortunate, we've got more flu deaths this year. These were global pandemics, and they were more deadly than COVID. And people, of course, they were sad when grandma and grandpa died, but they didn't have, they kind of said, well, life goes on, old people die, and you didn't have lockdowns. And So we had a bunch of lockdowns, which there's no evidence placed before courts by governments to demonstrate that lockdown saved any lives. But yeah, so there is sort of a heightened sensitivity that wasn't there in the past.
And it's especially a sick result of the absolute madness that took over the society of the Western societies in particular, but the whole planet really, that would simultaneously claim that they were enacting these draconian policies to protect the elderly while at the same time letting them die alone in nursing homes with bags of hot water filled medical gloves to hold instead of their loved ones' hands. You know, like I'll never forgive them for that. I'll never get over it, I don't think.
The way that so many people had to die alone and without their loved ones. They're in some sort of a sick, perverted, twisted, disgusting rhetoric about how we've got to we have to protect these people from COVID. Therefore they all have to die alone because it was illegal to visit your loved ones in a nursing home. It was disgusting. And the lockdowns didn't prevent COVID from getting into the nursing homes. I mean, this was the population. The only if you were under 70 and not in a nursing home and you're sort of, average, reasonable health, your risk of death or injury from driving in a motor vehicle, either as a driver or passenger, either way, your risk of death or injury from driving a car was higher than your risk of death or injury from COVID. And it was just, and everybody's driving their cars. Nobody's giving it a second thought, as it should be. And yet, this COVID thing gets dressed up as being far worse than what it is, and the lockdowns didn't protect the elderly who were in the nursing homes. They're the ones who took the brunt of COVID, and lockdowns didn't stop COVID from getting into the nursing homes. So it's just a lot of unnecessary suffering to have these seniors for weeks on end, months on end, being confined alone to their rooms and illegal to see their loved ones. What an evil thing to do.
Yeah, it's only possible with a media framework that essentially just defaults to a handful of experts with the same ideology. You didn't have any fact checks when Dina Hinshaw claimed that a youth died of COVID, but it was a terminally ill cancer. It was like stage 4 cancer, teenager with stage 4 cancer who died with a positive test. And that fact check, like the media, if it was doing its role, it would have fact checked that and it would have dug deeper. So you're seeing the same kind of the lack of questions asked and just rubber stamping these articles. You're seeing that in COVID, and you're seeing that now with a lot of the fears of the border, like crossing the border, this anti-American rhetoric, where they point to one case in Texas about a wife and husband getting deported after overstaying their visa, but they fail to mention that there's previous criminal charges for assault on a minor and like all these other details that would shift them from just a random family that just happens to overstay a visa by a month to a high priority case where a lot of the times this surface level gut reaction is somebody reading a headline, or they quickly read a headline and another headline, and they didn't dive deep. And the thoughts have already been planted there. The seeds have been planted. And even if a correction comes out, you don't undo those impressions that are trickled out over time. So I feel like this is just another reason to abolish the CRTC, especially that it's now enabling overt censorship with these additional bills that are coming out. So it's necessary that there's change, and I'm glad that this article is published now, especially that it's more necessary than ever to have some of these tough conversations. So,
Well, the good news is the CBC viewership is decreasing. Even other government-funded media. A while back, I was having coffee with one of the donors to the Justice Center, and he told me that his grandson has never heard of global news.
Good.
His 20-year-old grandson, to be specific, his 20-year-old grandson gets 100% of his media comes from X and TikTok, and he doesn't know what global news is. He's never heard of it. The younger people are so far removed from a generation where, and I remember I'm 58. I grew up in the 70s, and like if you wanted to watch the news, you'd make sure you got home by 6 o'clock to turn on the 6 o'clock news, right? And then there'd be another news at 10 and at 11, and that was the only way to get it, right? And it was through the television and radio and newspapers as well. But now with the internet and social media. So the good news is that these government-funded media are slowly dying a well-deserved death, and every month, I think independent podcasters and videocasters like yourselves, and we've got independent media like The Rebel and Juno News and the Epoch Times and the Western Standard and Blacklock's reporter based in Ottawa. All of these are growing, and it's wonderful. And it actually makes it harder for totalitarian dictator to take power because, if you can't control, right, if you can't centrally control information, you've got all these pockets of resistance. It's harder to be a tyrant than what it would have been in the 60s and 70s and 80s, when if you controlled the TV stations, the people would only be getting one thing at 6 p.m. and that was what you wanted the people to hear. There were no other television stations, right? It was CBC, CTV. I think Global came later. Anyway.
Yeah, and
so this is good.
It's very good. And so James and I are both 36, and I think being kind of smack dab in the middle of the millennial, maybe I think they define the millennial generation as from approximately 1980 to 1995. I think we're probably the last generation that would have ever grown up with our primary news source, at least in our childhoods, being on the TV and newspapers. And Gen Alpha, I think, is a little bit too young still, but Gen Z, having grown up with primarily internet-based news and social media news, is by far the most conservative generation in 100 years, they say. So I don't think that's a coincidence that once you stop being propagandized by your directly by your government-funded media, that would happen. So, Mr. John Carpay, do you have, just to be respectful of your time here, do you have any events coming up, any speaking engagements, anything you'd like to plug before we let you get on with your evening?
Well, the winner of the George Jonas Freedom Award for 2026 is Candace Malcolm, who heads up Juno News. And so we are going to have an event in Toronto in July, Vancouver in August, and then Calgary will be September 24th to honor Candace Malcolm. I am 90% sure that I will be in Edmonton. We're looking at a public meeting on Thursday, April 30th in Edmonton. I'll email you more information about that. And for those who are interested, the Justice Center, if you want to sign up for an email newsletter, we send it out only twice a month. So you're not going to get inundated. But if you go to our website, JCCF, Justice Center Constitutional Freedoms, jccf.ca, sign up for our newsletter, and that will keep you posted as well. If we do have events from time to time, we do geographical email blast to people in that in the area of the event. So yeah, we're going to keep on fighting till we win. Times are dark, things might get worse, but we just, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And so we press on, and we're going to keep on speaking truth to power and keep on fighting until we win.
Well, we're very, very glad that there are people like you behind the movement. We thank you for taking the time to discuss these things with just a couple of goofs from Edmonton, and always appreciate you having you on the show. And hopefully next time you guys have a big report, you'll let us chat with you about it again. And yeah, thank you, sir. We'll look forward to the next one.
Yeah, great to have you
Have
on.
a great rest of the night.
Cheers.
Cheers.